$60 and it's yours. Honestly, you'd be doing me a favor. Saves me the trouble of hauling it to the scrapyard with the rest of this junk." Rick gestured with a dismissive flick of his wrist towards a dusty corner of the pawn shop, where a small pile of rusted tools, a cracked guitar neck, and a forlorn-looking floor lamp awaited their final journey. Leaning against the wall, almost camouflaged by the shadows and grime, was the rifle. It was a long, wooden thing, its metal parts dulled to a flat, lifeless gray. The stock was a roadmap of scratches and dings, the wood oil-starved and pale. It looked less like a weapon and more like a forgotten piece of fence post. Rick had taken it in as part of a larger estate lot from a family clearing out their grandfather's garage. He'd given them $10 for it, and even then, he felt he'd been generous. It was a relic, and not the cool kind that collectors paid a premium for. It was just old, tired, and in his professional opinion, worthless. He'd been using it as a doorstop for a week until his wife complained it was scratching the linoleum. Now, it was officially junk. The man standing on the other side of the glass counter didn't respond immediately. He was old, maybe 70, maybe 80. His face was a testament to a life lived under the sun, with deep lines etched around his eyes and a leathery texture to his skin. He wore a faded flannel shirt, worn denim jeans, and boots that looked like they'd walked 1,000 miles of farmland. There was dirt permanently settled into the creases of his knuckles. Rick saw a dozen men like him every month, farmers from out past the county line coming into town for supplies, maybe looking for a cheap tool or a replacement part. They were men of few words and even fewer dollars. Rick sized him up in a heartbeat, a tire kicker, a window shopper, someone who'd grunt and leave. But this one was different. He wasn't looking at the flashy electronics or the jewelry. His eyes, a pale but startlingly clear blue, were fixed on the rifle in the junk pile. The old farmer, whose name was Samuel Finch, finally shifted his gaze from the rifle to Rick. He didn't look offended by the shop owner's blunt assessment. He didn't look excited by the low price either. He just looked. His expression was one of quiet, unreadable appraisal. 60, he repeated, his voice low and raspy, like stones tumbling in a slow-moving creek. It wasn't a question or the start of a haggle. It was a simple confirmation of a number. Rick leaned back, crossing his arms. He was a man who prided himself on reading people, on knowing the angle, the hustle. But there was no angle here, just a strange, placid stillness. Yeah, 60, cash, as is, where is. You haul it, you own it. All sales final on scrap. He added the last part with a little smirk, a bit of shopkeeper jargon that made him feel official. Samuel nodded slowly, his eyes drifting back to the rifle. From across the room, it was just a shape, but Samuel saw more. He saw the specific silhouette of the stock, the placement of the bolt, the length of the barrel. His posture, which had been slightly stooped from a long life of labor, seemed to straighten almost imperceptibly. His shoulders squared, just a fraction of an inch, but it was a change, like a dormant muscle remembering its function. He walked over to the corner, his movements economical and sure-footed, not the shuffling gait Rick expected. He didn't grab the rifle. He reached for it with a reverence that was completely at odds with its location in a pile of trash. His left hand went to the forestock, his right to the grip, finding the balance point with an instinct that seemed to bypass thought. He lifted it. The weapon, which should have been awkward and heavy, settled into his arms as if it were a natural extension of them. His calloused fingers, which Rick had dismissed as simple farmer's hands, wrapped around the wood with a quiet familiarity. They were large, scarred hands, but they were unnaturally steady. From another aisle, a young man watched the exchange. Corporal Mateo Diaz of the United States Marine Corps was on leave, visiting his parents. He'd come into the pawn shop looking for a decent, inexpensive watch to replace the one he'd shattered during a training exercise at 29 Palms. He was browsing the watches when the pawn owner's loud pronouncement about the junk rifle caught his ear. Diaz knew firearms. It was part of his job, part of his identity. He glanced over and saw what Rick saw, an old, beat-up bolt-action rifle, probably a hunting rifle left in a barn for 50 years. He was about to turn back to the watches when the old farmer picked it up. And that's when Diaz stopped. It wasn't what the man held, but how he held it. Diaz had spent hundreds of hours on the rifle range, watching instructors, both young and old, handle weapons. There was a language in it. A sloppy hold spoke of inexperience. A tense, rigid grip betrayed nerves. A casual, one-handed dangle suggested arrogance. The old farmer displayed none of these. He held the rifle at a perfect port arms, the barrel angled precisely, his elbows tucked in, his back straight. It was a posture drilled into recruits over thousands of repetitions until it became muscle memory, as natural as breathing. It was the posture of a man who had been formally trained. Diaz found himself staring, forgetting all about the watches. The farmer wasn't just holding a rifle, he was communing with it. He ran a thumb along the receiver, his touch gentle, like greeting an old friend. He didn't work the bolt or check the chamber, an amateur's first move. He just held it, his eyes tracing the lines of the wood, his expression distant, as if he were looking at something far beyond the cluttered walls of the pawn shop. Rick, oblivious, was already ringing up the sale on his register. "So, we doing this or what? I got other customers, Pops." Samuel carried the rifle to the counter and laid it down carefully, placing a small folded towel he pulled from his pocket onto the glass first to protect the wood. The gesture was so meticulous, so full of care, that it seemed absurd. It was like wrapping a rusty hubcap in velvet. Rick raised an eyebrow but said nothing, his hand outstretched for the money. Samuel pulled a worn leather wallet from his back pocket. It was held together with a thick rubber band. He unfolded it and carefully extracted 3 crisp $20 bills. He smoothed them on the counter before pushing them towards Rick. There was a dignity in the simple act that momentarily silenced the shop owner. "It's seen better days," Samuel said, his gaze still on the rifle. "But the bones are good," Rick grunted, scooping up the money and stuffing it into the register. "The bones are $60 worth of scrap metal, my friend. What you do with it is your business. Gonna hang it over the fireplace?" He was trying to make conversation, to grease the wheels of commerce, but it came out sounding condescending. Samuel didn't seem to notice. He was looking at a specific spot on the rifle stock, a dark circular stain no bigger than a dime. His thumb ghosted over it, a flicker of some deep-buried memory in his eyes. "Something like that," he said softly. "It deserves a place of honor." Diaz, standing a few feet away, felt a strange chill. It deserves a place of honor. People said that about medals, about flags, about fallen soldiers. They didn't say it about junk rifles they bought for $60. He watched as Samuel picked the rifle back up, cradling it in his arms, and turned to leave. As he passed, Diaz caught a clearer view of the weapon, and his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just any old bolt action. The shape of the stock, the design of the bolt handle, the specific configuration of the sights. It was a Springfield M1903. A legendary rifle, the primary service weapon for the first half of the 20th century. But it was more than that. Diaz's eyes narrowed, focusing on the receiver. Even under the grime and neglect, he could just make out the faint, elegant script of the manufacturer's mark. It was one of the early ones, a pre-World War I model. These were rare. To find one in a junk pile was like finding a diamond in a dumpster. But what held Diaz rooted to the spot was the old man. The posture, the hands, the quiet reverence. It was all starting to connect in a way that made the hair on his arms stand up. After Samuel left, the little bell over the door chiming his departure, Rick was in a fine mood. He'd made a $50 profit on a piece of trash he was going to have to pay to get rid of. It was the kind of small, satisfying victory that made his day. He turned his attention to his other customer. "Sorry about that," he said to Diaz, gesturing vaguely toward the door. "Now, a watch, you said. Let me show you our best Seikos, much better investment than that old piece of firewood." Diaz barely heard him. His mind was racing. The M1903. The old man's bearing. It couldn't be a coincidence. He was a history buff, especially Marine Corps history. He'd read everything he could get his hands on, from official battle reports to first-hand memoirs. Certain stories, certain legends were etched into his brain. He politely excused himself, telling Rick he'd think about the watch, and hurried out of the shop. The old farmer was just loading the rifle into the cab of a weathered blue Ford pickup truck. He had wrapped it in a thick wool blanket with the same meticulous care he'd shown in the store. "Sir?" Diaz called out, his voice respectful. "Excuse me, sir." Samuel turned. His clear blue eyes settled on Diaz, taking in his short military-style haircut, his straight posture, his youthful but serious face. He gave a slow, measured nod, waiting. "I'm sorry to bother you," Diaz began, feeling a little foolish. "I was in the shop. That rifle, it's a Springfield, isn't it? An M1903? Samuel's expression didn't change, but a new light entered his eyes, a flicker of recognition. "That's right," he said. "Good eye, son." "My grandfather carried one in Korea," Diaz said, which was true. "He said it was the most honest rifle ever made, said you could always count on it." This was his way of building a bridge, of showing he wasn't just some curious kid. He was part of the tribe. He understood. Samuel's face softened almost imperceptibly. "Your grandfather was a wise man. It is an honest rifle. It tells the truth, whether you want to hear it or not." He patted the blanket-wrapped shape in his truck. "This one has told a lot of truths in its time." There was a small, nearly obliterated unit marking painted on the stock, something Diaz had only glimpsed. He decided to take a chance. From the markings, I couldn't see it clearly, but it looked like 5th Marines. Samuel went very still. The friendly rural mask dropped away, replaced by an intense, penetrating focus. He looked at Diaz, truly looked at him, and for the first time, the young corporal felt like he was being scanned, assessed, and measured by a man who knew exactly what to look for. The farmer's gaze swept over him, noting the way he stood at a relaxed parade rest, the discipline in his posture that he couldn't hide even in civilian clothes. "You know your history," Samuel stated. It wasn't a compliment, it was an acknowledgement of fact. "Some of it," Diaz replied, his voice steady. "I know the 5th Marines fought at Belleau Wood in 1918. I know the Germans called them devil dogs, and I know the Marine Corps marksmen there, with their M1903s, were legendary. They were hitting targets at 800 yards, stopping enemy advances cold." The air between them grew thick with unspoken history. The sounds of the town, the traffic, the distant chatter, seemed to fade away. They were two men, separated by 60 years, standing on common ground. Samuel reached into the truck and gently unwrapped a small section of the rifle, revealing the stock. He pointed with a scarred finger to a tiny, almost invisible notch carved into the wood just below the trigger guard. It was no more than a scratch. "You see that?" he asked. Diaz leaned in. "Yes, sir." "Every man in my platoon had a rifle just like this one," Samuel said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a storyteller's cadence. "But only one rifle had this mark. The man who carried it put it there himself, with the tip of his K-bar. Said it was to remind him." "Remind him of what?" Diaz asked, his heart pounding. Samuel looked away from the rifle, his eyes fixed on a point in the distant sky, a point somewhere back in the mists of 1918. "To remind him that one man in the right place, at the right time, with a true rifle and a steady hand, can make a difference. The man who carried this rifle, he made a difference at Belleau Wood." He didn't say anything more. He didn't have to. Diaz understood. This wasn't just an M1903. This was a piece of history, a sacred object. He felt a profound sense of awe, followed by a hot surge of anger at the pawnshop owner who had called it junk and tossed it in a corner. "He sold it to you for $60, Diaz said, his voice tight with disbelief. Samuel finally looked back at him, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. "The man didn't sell me the rifle. He only sold me the wood and the steel. The rest, the history, the honor, that was never his to sell." Back at the pawn shop, Rick was having a conversation that would change the course of his life. His friend, a serious gun collector named George, had stopped by on his lunch break. Rick, still puffed up from his morning's transaction, decided to brag. "You should have seen it, George. This old farmer came in, paid $60 for the rustiest piece of junk you've ever laid eyes on. An old Springfield. Looked like it had been buried for a century." George, who had been inspecting a vintage watch, froze. He turned around slowly. "A Springfield? You mean an M1903? "Yeah, I guess," Rick said dismissively. "Long wooden stock, bolt action, you know the type." George's expression grew serious. "Rick, there are Springfields, and then there are Springfields. What were the markings on the receiver?" Rick had to think for a moment. He prided himself on having a good eye for detail, even on things he considered worthless. Springfield Armory, I think. The serial number was low, 6 digits. Pretty worn. George put the watch down. His full attention was now on Rick. A 6-digit serial number? Rick, that puts it pre-1918. Was there anything else? Any other markings? Nah, just a bunch of scratches. Oh wait, Rick said, snapping his fingers. There was some faded paint on the stock. Looked like a number 5 inside some kind of, I don't know, a diamond or something. George's face went pale. He walked over to the counter and leaned on it, his voice dropping to a horrified whisper. Rick, a number 5 and a diamond. Was it an Indian head? Rick's smugness began to evaporate, replaced by a cold knot of dread in his stomach. Maybe? Yeah, I think so. Why? What does it mean? George looked at him as if he'd just confessed to setting fire to a museum. The 5th Marine Regiment. The Indian head was part of their insignia in World War I. Rick, the rifles issued to their best marksmen before the Belleau Wood campaign were specially selected for accuracy. They were practically sniper rifles before the term was even common. They're the stuff of legend. Most were lost, destroyed in combat, or scrapped after the war. A handful, maybe 5 or 6, are known to exist in museums or private collections. They're priceless. Rick felt the blood drain from his face. He stared at the empty space in the corner where the rifle had been. The word junk echoed in his mind, mocking him. Priceless? What do you mean priceless? Like a few thousand? George shook his head, his eyes wide with the enormity of what Rick had done. No, you don't understand. We're not talking about money. This is about history. A verified Belleau Wood marksman's rifle. That's a national treasure. That belongs in the Marine Corps Museum at Quantico. That's a piece of the soul of the Corps. You said an old farmer bought it? Rick could only nod, his mouth suddenly dry. He remembered the old man's steady hands, his clear eyes, the almost religious way he had handled the rifle. He had seen it, but he hadn't understood. He had seen a farmer, not a custodian. He had seen $60, not a century of honor. Oh, God, Rick whispered, slumping against the counter. What did I do? He scrambled for the receipt book, his hands trembling. The old man hadn't given a name, just paid cash. There was no record, no phone number, no address. He was just a ghost who had walked in, recognized a forgotten king sitting on a beggar's throne, and walked out with it for the price of a cheap dinner. I have to find him, Rick said, a desperate edge to his voice. I have to get it back. George looked at him with a mixture of pity and disgust. And what are you going to do, Rick? Offer him $100 for it after you called it junk and sold it for 60? The man who bought that rifle knew exactly what it was. Trust me, he didn't just buy a firearm, he rescued it. The words hit Rick like a physical blow. He rescued it. The old man hadn't been a clueless farmer getting fleeced. He had been a savior, and Rick had been the fool who had left a masterpiece out in the rain. He spent the rest of the day in a daze, going through the motions of his business, but his mind was far away. He was replaying the morning's events over and over, each detail now cast in a new, humiliating light. The farmer's quiet dignity, the careful way he handled the rifle, the soft-spoken words. It deserves a place of honor. He had been told the truth, but he had been too arrogant and too blind to hear it. Samuel Finch drove the old Ford truck down a long gravel lane, dust billowing behind him. He didn't live on a sprawling farm, but a small, tidy homestead with a modest white house, a sturdy red barn, and a workshop that was his sanctuary. He carried the blanket-wrapped rifle from the truck to the workshop with the care of a man carrying a sleeping child. Inside, the workshop was a marvel of order. Tools hung in their designated places, the floor was swept clean, and the air smelled of sawdust, oil, and time. He placed the rifle on a long wooden workbench, under the bright, clean light of an overhead lamp. For a long while, he just stood there, looking at it. He wasn't seeing the scratches or the rust. He was seeing the hands that had held it. Young hands, strong hands, hands that had trembled with cold in the trenches of France, hands that had been rock steady when looking through the sights. He ran his own scarred hand over the stock, feeling the grain of the American walnut. He had carried a rifle just like this one, in a different war, on a different continent. He knew its weight, its balance, its kick. He knew the satisfying clack of the bolt chambering a round. He knew the trust a man placed in the tool that stood between him and eternity. The rifle was more than a mechanism of wood and steel. It was a repository of courage, a silent witness to sacrifice. He spent the next several hours in a state of meditative focus. He didn't begin a grand restoration. He began a gentle cleaning. He mixed a solution of linseed oil and turpentine, a recipe his own father had taught him, and began to slowly, painstakingly work it into the dry wood of the stock. He used soft cotton cloths, moving in small, patient circles. As he worked, the wood began to drink in the oil, its pale, thirsty surface transforming. The deep, rich colors of the walnut began to emerge from beneath the decades of neglect, like a landscape appearing through a lifting fog. The scratches and dings didn't vanish. He didn't want them to. They were part of the story. They were the scars of its service. He was just helping the wood remember its strength. He used a fine brass brush and a special solvent to gently work on the metal parts, lifting the rust without scratching the pitted steel beneath. It was a slow, deliberate process, an act of respect. With each careful stroke, he felt like he was erasing the indignity the rifle had suffered, sitting in a garage, forgotten, and then tossed into a junk pile. He was restoring its honor. Rick couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the old farmer's face, those clear blue eyes that seemed to see right through him. The next morning, he opened his shop, but his heart wasn't in it. He felt a profound sense of shame. He had spent his life judging things by their surface value, by what he could get for them. He had never once considered that some things had a value that couldn't be measured in dollars. He had to try. He had to find the man. He only had one clue. The man looked like a farmer. Rick got in his car and just started driving, heading out of town into the sprawling countryside. He stopped at every gas station, every feed store, every local diner. He described the old man, the old blue Ford truck. Most people just shook their heads, but in a small diner 20 miles out of town, a waitress recognized the description. "Sounds like Mr. Finch," she said. "Samuel Finch. Lives out on the old Ridge Road. Quiet man, keeps to himself mostly." She gave him directions, and Rick felt a surge of adrenaline. He drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, rehearsing what he would say. He'd apologize. He'd offer to buy it back for $5,000, $10,000, whatever it took. He just needed to undo his mistake. He found the gravel lane and drove up to the modest homestead. It was just as he'd pictured, clean, orderly, and quiet. He saw the blue truck parked near the barn. He got out of his car, his heart hammering in his chest. He felt like a trespasser, a fool coming to beg for a treasure he had willingly thrown away. He walked towards the workshop, the only building with lights on inside. The large double doors were open to the morning air, and there, at the workbench, was Samuel Finch. He had his back to the door, hunched over the rifle. He was working on the bolt assembly now, using delicate tools to clean and oil each intricate part. The rifle itself was transformed. The wood glowed with a deep, healthy luster, and the metal had been cleaned to a respectable gunmetal gray. It no longer looked like junk. It looked formidable. It looked like it was ready to serve again. Rick stood at the edge of the doorway, unable to speak for a moment. He watched Samuel work. There was no wasted motion. Every movement was precise, efficient, and filled with a quiet competence that was mesmerizing. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Mr. Finch?" Samuel didn't startle. He finished tightening a small screw before he slowly turned around. His face was calm, his blue eyes showing no surprise. It was as if he had been expecting him. "Mr. Rick?" he said, his voice even. "I figured I might be seeing you." Rick felt his prepared speech crumble to dust. The man's quiet dignity disarmed him completely. I came to apologize," Rick stammered. "The rifle. I didn't know what it was. I was ignorant, disrespectful. I'm so sorry." Samuel simply nodded, accepting the apology without fanfare. "Most people wouldn't know," he said. "It's been a long time." "I want to buy it back," Rick blurted out, pulling out his checkbook. "I'll give you $10,000 for it, right now. It belongs in a museum. My friend told me it's a piece of history." Samuel looked from the checkbook to the rifle resting on the bench, then back to Rick. He didn't look angry or tempted. He just looked a little sad. "It's not for sale," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Its monetary value doesn't interest me." "But it's a historical artifact," Rick insisted, his voice rising with desperation. "It needs to be preserved, seen by people." Samuel walked over to the rifle and picked it up. He held it not like an artifact, but like a sacred trust. "Preserving something isn't about putting it behind glass, Mr. Rick. Sometimes it's about giving it a quiet place to rest among friends. This rifle didn't fight for a museum. It fought for a home. And now, it has one." He turned the rifle over, showing Rick the stock, where the faded insignia of the 5th Marines was now clean and visible. The man who carried this rifle gave everything he had in a muddy forest in France a long, long time ago. His name is probably forgotten by everyone but the earth he's buried in. This rifle is all that's left of his story. It doesn't need to be seen by everyone. It just needs to be remembered by someone. In that moment, Rick finally understood. It was never about the money. It was never about ownership. It was about stewardship. It was about honor. His $10,000 offer was as meaningless and insulting as his $60 price tag had been. Both were just attempts to put a number on something that was immeasurable. He slowly put his checkbook away, a profound sense of humility washing over him. He had come to buy back a valuable object. He was leaving with a lesson in what true value really meant. He looked at Samuel, at his weathered face and steady hands, and he didn't see an old farmer anymore. He saw a guardian. "I understand," Rick said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." He turned and walked away without another word, leaving Samuel alone in his workshop with the quiet companion he had rescued from oblivion. Rick went back to his pawn shop, but he was a different man. The next day, he cleared out the flashiest, most expensive display case right by the front door. He didn't fill it with jewelry or high-end electronics. He built a small, respectful display. He put in a few old military medals he'd acquired over the years, a folded flag, and a small, professionally printed card. The card didn't tell the story of the rifle. That wasn't his story to tell. It simply said, "In honor of the quiet custodians of our history, the ones who remember." It was a silent, permanent apology and the beginning of a new kind of wisdom.